It was a routine traffic stop on a quiet afternoon, but for one elderly black man, this moment would change everything. As two white police officers approached his car, they had no idea that the man sitting behind the wheel was about to shake the very foundations of their state. Unaware of his identity, they questioned him, unaware that this man was no ordinary citizen. He was the newly elected governor. As tension built in the air, the officer's casual disregard for his status quickly turned into something much more serious. What happened next left them stunned, and it left the entire state holding its breath. How would this encounter unfold, and what consequences would it hold for both the police and the new governor? The answers might surprise you. Stick around because this story is only just beginning. As the officers stood at the car, they exchanged glances, unsure of how to approach this elderly man. He wasn't dressed in any obvious way that screamed public figure. His clothes were simple, an old suit, a slightly wrinkled shirt, and a pair of glasses perched on his nose. Nothing about him screamed power, but there was a quiet dignity about him that seemed out of place in the situation. The officers were accustomed to handling traffic stops like this, but there was something different this time. The man's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension in the air. The more they questioned him, the more they realized there was something they were missing. He didn't seem nervous or intimidated. In fact, his responses were measured and thoughtful. But why was he in this neighborhood, and why didn't he seem to care about the routine interrogation? The unanswered questions hung thick in the air, and with every word that passed, the mystery deepened. The officers, now growing more frustrated with the elderly man's composed answers, began to push harder. One of them, Officer Daniels, leaned in slightly, his voice tightening. "Sir, do you have any identification on you? Any reason you're being so evasive?" The question wasn't just about his driver's license. It was loaded with suspicion. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a small wallet, handing over a sleek, official-looking ID. The officer took it, eyes scanning the name on the card. His hand trembled slightly as he read. Asterisk Governor Ellis Montgomery. Asterisk, the name didn't immediately register, but something about it triggered a shift in the air. Officer Daniels stepped back, staring at the card in disbelief, as his partner, Officer Green, squinted at the man. "Wait, are you telling me you're the new governor?" There was a long pause. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. The tension that had been building since the stop suddenly reached its breaking point. Neither officer knew how to process what they were seeing. To them, Montgomery looked like just another older man in a small town, nothing like the polished politicians they were used to seeing in the media. But in that moment, something deeper lingered in the air. Officer Green glanced around nervously, unsure of what to do next. Montgomery's reputation as a candidate had been one of hope, change, and breaking barriers. Yet here he was, facing something that could shatter all of that. How could they, the men sworn to protect and serve, have so badly misunderstood the man they were meant to respect? Would their misunderstanding now lead to something bigger, more dangerous? They were caught in a trap of their own making, unsure of how to handle the situation. But Montgomery, sensing the tension, broke the silence. His voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of authority. "You can check the ID all you want, but I suggest you remember who you're speaking to." It was clear he wasn't just a victim of mistaken identity. There was power in his words, something that made the officers question not just their own actions, but the very system they upheld. Officer Daniels blinked, still holding the ID in his hand, as if it might suddenly transform into something else. His mouth felt dry, his mind racing. How had they missed this? How had they let this moment escalate so far? His eyes darted to his partner, Officer Green, who looked equally uncertain, caught between confusion and fear. Montgomery remained calm, his expression unreadable, but there was a weight in the air. He was no longer just an elderly man. He was someone with power, someone who could tear apart their world with a single word. And that word hadn't come yet. Daniels cleared his throat and took a step back, feeling the sweat gather on his neck. He motioned to Green, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for his radio. The situation had spiraled too far. He wasn't sure what to say, how to explain this, but he needed backup. They couldn't handle this alone. They didn't know the depth of what they were dealing with. Central, we've got a situation here, Daniel said, his voice low, as if speaking louder would make it worse. We've got a possible, mistaken identity. The radio crackled in response, but the words were drowned out by Montgomery's next statement, sharp and clear. I don't think it's a mistake anymore, he said, his voice like ice cutting through the tension. The officers froze. They hadn't expected the man to speak with such weight, such command. Officer Green's eyes widened, and he instinctively took a step back, his hand brushing against the sidearm at his belt. Montgomery noticed, but he didn't react. Instead, he turned his gaze to the horizon, his thoughts seemingly drifting far from the scene before him. You don't know who I am, do you? Montgomery continued, his tone now more resigned than angry. It's not just about my identity, not just about my position. It's about what I represent. A system that's built to keep people like me invisible. And now I'm here, in front of you, and you don't know how to handle it. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Daniels didn't speak, his mind spinning. What did he mean? What was Montgomery implying? There was something dark in those words, something deeper than just a misunderstanding. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It was a symbol of everything wrong with the system that put them in this moment. The air felt heavier now, the weight of history and power hanging between the officers, and the man who had once been just another unknown citizen. But not anymore. Montgomery had stepped into the light, and it seemed impossible to step back into the shadows. We need to get this figured out, Officer Green muttered, but the uncertainty in his voice was unmistakable. He didn't know what Montgomery had in mind, but he could feel the impending storm. And then, just as Daniels began to speak again, a car screeched to a halt behind them. It was a black SUV, windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever was inside. Both officers turned, hearts pounding, sensing the shift in the air. Montgomery stood still, watching, waiting, as the door to the SUV swung open with a quiet, deliberate creak. The tension was unbearable. The officers exchanged a look. This was more than a traffic stop. It was the beginning of something neither of them could fully comprehend. The SUV door swung open slowly, but instead of another official, a woman stepped out. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, her dark sunglasses reflecting the late afternoon sun. She didn't look like someone who had just arrived for a routine visit. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the pavement, a presence so commanding it almost seemed to alter the air around her. Montgomery's expression didn't change, but the officers exchanged quick glances, their hearts beating faster now. Something about the woman felt out of place, too calm, too confident for a regular bystander. She looked directly at the two officers as if she already knew everything. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with an underlying sharpness. Officer Daniels instinctively took a step back, the weight of the situation pressing down harder than ever. "Ma'am, where? We've got an ID issue here," he stammered, still holding the card that Montgomery had handed him. The woman barely glanced at him. Her gaze was fixed on Montgomery now, and for a brief moment, Something flickered between them. A recognition, a shared understanding. The officers didn't know what it was, but it felt as though they were witnessing something they weren't supposed to see. Then, without warning, she turned back to the officers. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, do you?" she asked, her voice now cold and cutting. "This man is not just the governor. He's part of something much bigger." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken promise of secrets yet to be uncovered. Before he could respond, the woman pulled out her own badge, showing it briefly before slipping it back into her jacket. It was clear she wasn't just anyone. She had power. "We've been monitoring this situation from the start," she continued, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the officers. "And you've made a very grave mistake." Officer Green's stomach twisted. He had no idea what was happening, but something told him they were in over their heads. This wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding or a case of mistaken identity. This was something much darker, something far beyond their training.